So first I'm going to talk about stem cells. Now this, as some of you may remember from health, is a picture of the female reproductive system. When you are talking about stem cells, you need to decide ethically. The question is not, are you a terrible person, or do you believe that stem cells can be used for research? The question is, do you believe life begins at conception or implantation? First, let's talk about conception. Conception is easy. Conception happens when egg meets sperm. This is your ovary. When you produce an egg, when a woman is born with as many eggs as she's going to have. But when a woman puts an egg up here into the fallopian tubes, it has the chance of being met by a sperm. And then you have conception. So right here, you have conception. This is the moment that egg meets sperm. The egg and the sperm, as an embryo, live here in the fallopian tube from 5 to 7 days. At this point, you have a blastocyst cell. Blastocyst cells are what is used for embryonic research. It has to travel, your conception, or your blastocyst cell, has to travel somewhere between 5 and 7 days down through the fallopian tubes into the uterus. When it implants into the uterus, that's when you have implantation. That's when you are pregnant. Up here, a woman is not pregnant. No pregnancy tests can detect that because she's not pregnant. There's not a lot of research known in terms of how many pregnancies result from conception that don't make it into implantation. Natural pregnancies. Now, when they do research and look at in vitro fertilization, only about 50%. So you'll hear that number a lot. I think it probably is fairly accurate that about 50% of the blastocyst cells, or the embryos, that become embryos, egg meets sperm, 50% of those don't actually make it to implantation. They're just shed. The argument says, well, if 50% of them don't implant anyway, I don't really believe that life begins up here. I believe life begins when and if there's implantation. When and if there's implantation, that's when I believe life begins. On the other side of that coin, there is no stopping. Once conception happens, it's a flowing process. And so the other half of people would say, I believe that life begins here, at conception. The moment that egg meets sperm, that's when life begins. So that is a decision that you have to make for yourself. You'll also hear the word in the literature, the word ensoulment. When is a soul given to the child? The argument again is, I believe the soul is given here, I believe the soul is given here. You'll find the argument for ensoulment less with conception, because again, if ensoulment happens here and 50% of these don't become implanted, then you are looking at kind of the large loss of life. So that is the difference between stem cells, whether you believe that stem cells are human or not, or that stem cells should be used for research, because at this 5 to 7 day stage, you have an embryo, you have a blastocyst cell. That is when stem cells are used. Now, how are they taken? There's a lot of misconception that stem cells are taken from women, which they are not, that stem cells are taken as abortions, which they are not. Stem cells, legally used by the NIH, the National Institute of Health, are only used after in vitro fertilization. Typically, if someone goes through in vitro fertilization, they get between 5 and 10 embryos. Up here, egg meets sperm, embryos, egg meets sperm, so they'll have 5 or 10 of those. They can only plant 2 or 3 at a time. If after the first time they get implantation, they can have between 7 and 10 embryos left. Very often they have a pregnancy, they're happy, they don't want to use any of the other embryos, so you have these 5 to 7 day embryos stored in liquid nitrogen. Somewhere in vitro fertilization clinics. There seems to be millions of them, and that is where the stem cells come from. They don't come from abortions. You wouldn't even get stem cells. Once the embryo implants, there really is no sense of a stem cell. The cells then begin to differentiate. They begin to become an eye, a head, hair cells, skin cells. They're not a blob of undifferentiated cells, meaning when they're up here, this 5 to 7 day embryonic cell can become anything. That's why they use stem cells. The first question in stem cells, as you think through it, is, do I believe life begins at conception or implantation? The second thing you really have to decide is, if you believe, I believe that life begins, this is what you're saying, I believe life begins here with implantation. But many people that I know, that I think generally, don't believe life begins at conception. They believe life begins at implantation. But they're still against stem cell research. What they're saying is, I don't think this is a good use of an embryo. I do believe this is the beginning of a life, it's a potential life, even though I don't think it has a soul, even though I think life begins here. I don't think us using these precious embryos for experimental purposes is the proper use of something of this nature. And there are those that say, well, hey, they're frozen in liquid nitrogen, what do you want to do with them anyway? We might as well use them for research because they're saving people's lives. Two sides. So there's really separate questions. It's not just a matter of, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in stem cell research. Do I believe that life happens at conception or implantation? If I believe life happens at implantation, do I believe that stem cell research is a proper use of these embryos? And many people would say no. If you believe life begins at conception, up here, you're of course against stem cell research. You're going to be against anything that hinders this process of implantation. That's going to include IUDs, that's going to include forms of birth control that prevent women from having periods. Usually it's because it prevents implantation. So anything like that you're going to be against. The morning after pill, that is the mode of action of the morning after pill. The morning after pill, you have 5 to 7 days, remember? So if you think you might have gotten conception and you don't want implantation, it removes the lining of this uterus and it prevents implantation. That's the mode of action of the morning after pill. And again, depending on where you think life begins, is where you're going to see these birth control methods. You believe that life begins here, you again have to decide, what do I think is the proper use of these embryos? The second question, and another question that I want to just roll in here because I think it's important, is the issue of in vitro fertilization. If you are anti-stem cell, for example, you have to say to yourself, what should we do with these millions of embryos that are frozen in liquid nitrogen? What is the proper use for these? Should they just be destroyed? There's really hardly a way to have them all implanted in women. It's very expensive. It's a painful procedure. But you can be on that. You can say, I think they should all be given away for free as adoptions to see how many of them we can use. But I think the stem cell research issue actually should be going back a step further to the in vitro clinics. If they weren't producing all these extra embryos, we wouldn't have them to use for research. So, with that in mind, I also think probably none of you are there yet, but some of you will be, and almost all of you will know someone who is going through treatments for infertility. And I think at that point, you should really decide before you go to the clinic where you're going to draw the line. We're going to produce embryos, but we're only going to produce as many as we can implant. We're going to produce embryos, but we're not going to let them be used for research. We're not going to produce embryos. We're going to go to fertility clinics, but we're not going to do in vitro where they create embryos. So I think a lot of these questions you need to think of now before you're sitting in the fertility clinic and their doctor is harvesting eggs from the woman and making 10 or 15 embryos. Should there be a limit on the number of embryos created? What should go with those? So there's several issues with stem cells. It's not as simple as, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in stem cell research. You really want to be able to articulate your beliefs very well. I don't believe in stem cell research because I believe life happens at conception. Good answer. I don't believe in stem cell research because I believe, even though I believe life doesn't happen until implantation, I don't think this is a good use of embryos. Or, I'm a Christian, I believe that implantation is when life begins. I believe that this is when life begins, and so I'm fine with stem cell research. I think this is a great use of technology. One of those three things is a well thought out answer to this question. It helps you look at different areas within the debate and helps you sort of decide for yourself what you believe about this issue.